Thanks for coming on an early Saturday.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for coming out. My name is Dean Daderko. I'm the curator here at the Contemporary Arts Museum, Houston, and worked very closely with Paul over the past 4 years to organize this 25-year survey exhibition. It has been a total pleasure.
Same here.
Just to give folks a bit of background, we'll do about a 45-minute walkthrough, talking about selected works in the exhibition, and then we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for questions from the audience.
What was the last time you bit someone? A long time ago, right?
I
think it's safe to get closer then.
Good one.
So, you never know with Dean.
So I guess we can jump right in. Although I would like to give you a little bit of background about Paul's work. Paul was born here in the States, raised in Honduras, attended graduate school at the Rhode Island School of Design in Providence, and then afterwards moved back to New York, which was roughly around the time that he and I met. So we have known each other for about 24 years. And I think that's probably one of the kind of very special things, although it was one of the things that also made me the most frightened about organizing this. Like, would I be able to actually back up enough to kind of be objective about the exhibition?
Well, you were certainly more objective than I could have ever been.
There you go. We balanced each other out in that way. So as you'll see when you start to walk through the exhibition, some of the recurrent themes, I think, are issues about participation. Paul has actually said, very insightfully, that there are three kinds of work within the exhibition. Works in which you can participate directly as viewers. Each of you have that opportunity.
About a third of the work is like that here. You will actually be able to participate with it in some way.
Yeah. Another third of the work then are works that offered participation to viewers in other sites, either site-specific or transactional works that happened in other places. And we're trying to tell the stories of some of those works here because they do feel like they're important touchstones. And then another set of works which kind of talk to issues that are important in those participatory works, either by talking about the idea of the viewer as a kind of body in the work, talking about the voice, etc.
Yeah.
So I think just because it's an easy place for us to start, maybe one of the first works that we can talk about is a work that I think is a particularly interesting work and has become really one of my special favorites within the exhibition, which is called Talisman.
Sure. Oh, I'll take it.
You take over.
No, I mean, Talisman is also very dear to me because it's one of those works that unfortunately you don't get to participate in anymore. It's one of those that it happens somewhere else. But I was asked to participate in the Sao Paulo Biennial, and it takes place, and this work encompasses many of the things I'm interested in. It's a public institution. It happens every 2 years. It's in a beautiful museum in Brazil, this pavilion that was built specifically for it. And what I proposed was that I would give away the keys to the front door of the museum to any viewer of the exhibition that wanted to. So I made these blanks that represent some symbolism. One shows a hand with a key going into the palm of the hand as if you could open another person up. And the other motif in the other side of the key shows you an architectural detail that's well known in Sao Paulo about that museum, so you know what it's a key for. And the curators of the exhibition said, sure, let's do it. Okay, let's give away the key. Now, I don't believe that participation is just a free giveaway, right? It should be an exchange. It should be a contract that's enacted. So to get those keys, people would have to stand in line and go to this little booth, and then they would have to let the museum copy any key from their keychain. And then the museum would take that key, and then in turn, so you give them a key to your place, whatever place you want. It could be a drawer, it could be the shed in the back, whatever. And then they give you a key to the front door of the museum. And of course, the legal department then is like, wow, whoa, wait a second, you know, people are going to come here after hours. And then they said, everyone must sign this waiver. And the waiver is really beautiful because the lawyers, what they did is they just formalized what all of us know how to do, which is how to behave in an exhibition space, you know. So I said, well, can I play with this? And they said, as long as people sign the waiver, it's fine. That's all we need. So I said, can I put commentary? And there's like, as long as it's clear what your voice is and what our voice is, do it. So I wrote a preamble that comes, that's lifted and inspired by the opening of the UN Charter, and then a little conclusion that's inspired by the Brazilian Constitution's conclusion. And then I wrote little commentary on the legal things that you can read. And then everyone signed it communally, right? So they would sign it. So to me, what's important is, one is, it's not a free giveaway. You're engaging in a contract, in an exchange with the institution. Two, you get to witness yourself with other people doing the same thing. So when people would sign this, they would have to find an empty spot and put their name with the names of other people. And I think like this is what we do. It's what we're doing right now, right? There's the museum director. The museum director signed the document. There's the curator. The curator signed the document. And there's the artist, and I signed the document. And then there's you, and in that instance, you all signed the document. And this is what an art show is, right? It's this agreement that we're like all gonna work together to be here at the same time to make some kind of artwork happen. And usually I let these things just be like, that happened there and that's it, you know? But when this was finished, it's like original sin. I was like, oh, it's just too awesome. So then I framed it, and then I took all the keys that people gave and we framed those. And then I made a triptych and I also framed 2 examples of the keys.
And I think that notion of this idea of trust
Right.
and of social interactions is something that we'll return to as a subject over and over in the work. But if we start to move up this way, I think the next work that we'll talk about that also looks at the idea of the individual and individual kind of contract in a certain way, but in a much more expanded way, is Assembly Ghazi Stadium. There are a number of other works in the exhibition, other drawings that utilize this motif of the admit one ticket. But in this particular instance, Ghazi Stadium is a stadium located in Kabul, Afghanistan. There are concerts there. There are soccer games there. Also, slightly more infamously, it's a site for public executions. The stadium itself, which of course you're looking at here as a kind of overview, can accommodate 20,500 spectators. And in this idea of a kind of parody, what Paul has done is to create this overview out of 20,500 admit one tickets. This idea of one body, one entrance, right. is something that's very much at the kind of heart of this work.
And it's an interest also I have in how can I make artworks with materials that we're all familiar with, that we usually have in our bodies. So many years ago, I emptied when I started to make work like this more and more, one day I emptied all my pockets in my studio, and I was like, I think I can only make art with this, right? If I'm really gonna ask all of you to engage in exchanges. And then, so I pay a lot of attention to things like keys. We all have them, but if you think about it, they mean a lot of things about trust, lack of trust, safety, and then this ticket, which in a way resembles democracy, right? One person, one vote, one person, one entrance. And also I'm interested in the intimacy of that, and also how big do you have to get before you lose that intimacy, right? Like the little concert at your local cafe and you know half the people versus like a giant stadium. Or why do we get together? To listen to a curator and artist speak? Yes. For a soccer game? Yes. For an execution? Well, yes, we also do that. And what shape do we take? Look at the shape you've taken, right? You already know how to assume this shape, and this shape is basically a Greek theater. You've made a slight semicircle, right? So these shapes that we know to assemble in are deeply ingrained in our culture and profound, and we can't see them, right? So my hope is always like, oh, if I could only make it so it can be visible that we're together now for a very specific purpose and we know how to do it or forgot how to do it maybe. So.
And I think one of the ways, Paul, that you do that, that is so convincing is through the way that you're exploring materiality in your work. There is in here a lot of work that has a kind of particular material that I think, you know, develops a certain kind of interest for a viewer. Like, oh, what is this thing? Like looking at this from far away, it's like a pixelated image. And then from a certain distance, understanding what this object is as you move towards it. Or, for instance, the core course in the commons, if we kind of spin around and refocus, and now we get to actually stand behind everyone else. And Paul, maybe you can talk a little bit about the commons. It's a work that was made in 2011.
Yeah. Was that? Yeah.
And
you know better.
And really reimagines the equestrian monument. Specifically here, I think it's important to recognize that the rider has been removed, so the horse is somewhat freed.
Yes, free of like, it's a monument, but we don't know, you know, there's no George Washington there, there's no Marcus Aurelius, there's no General Grant. It's like, it's a monument, somewhat generic, somewhat specific.
And I think another thing that we can notice about this object straight off is that normally when we're looking at the base of such an object, we would encounter an inscription, either into the stone, perhaps on a brass plaque, that talks about a specific individual or a specific event that happened in a moment that's being memorialized. Yeah. Here, what I think is important is that Paul is actually extending an invitation to each and every one of you to attach something to the base of this sculpture using a push pin.
Yeah, and you spoke of materiality. It's like I'm really interested in materiality, and back to the things in your pockets. These are materials you're really familiar with. Like if an artist were to make things with keys and there was a fake key, you would know right away. So like these are perforated. Like we use these things every day. So like you got to be really precise. And I like to make work without instructions. So I'm like, cork and push pins, you know what to do. We don't even need to explain it, right? But what I like to think is the reverse. Why stone and bronze, right? Stone and bronze is so those inscriptions in public space are permanent. So we'll all come and go, but whatever was said in that public space by people usually more powerful than us will remain. So I try to imagine the monuments like, what would it be if it was made for us, right? For our voices. Oh, well, then the material has to switch. It can be bronze, it can be stone, it can be steel. It has to be a material that can allow all of us to contribute to it, and it can't have a rider, so it doesn't have a fixed meaning. But there's always a give and take. You get to say something, but it's ephemeral, because it is not stone and bronze. So I'm always thinking of these paradoxes, you know, it's like, and they're essentially paradoxes of democracy, like, if everyone gets to say their little bit, then you only get to say a little bit. Darn it. You know, like if everybody gets to say something in public space, it can be permanent because it's a finite amount of space. So if I made a piece where all of you can put something in stone, well, we run out of space right away. So, so I'm always thinking about like democracy, participation, materials, and how that interplays.
And I think that's a kind of good jumping off point to also discuss the next work
Which
that
one's
we're
that,
getting
Dean?
to, which will be public trust. So let's go over this way. This kind of notion of participation takes many different forms in Paul's work. Specifically here, this table will be activated every Saturday for the run of this exhibition from 1 o'clock to 5 o'clock. So people can come during that time, and what we're asking folks to do is sit down either with the artist or one of the facilitators to make a promise. this idea of looking at the value of your word and word as bond, the idea that all of us can make promises, but what do those promises mean? And what do those commitments mean to each of us? What's the strength of that word is something that I feel is at the core of this work. And Paul, maybe you can talk a little bit about the kind of process.
Yeah. So one thing that curatorially Dean has tried to do, which I think is important, is like, I don't know about you, but when I go to a museum and it's like, in 1964 this happened, it's like, well, I wasn't there. So we have this line of tables that all show this kind of participatory work where it's like, well, I wish I had been there. But we added one table that you will be able to. So maybe you can have some empathy for the other ones. But this is the most recent work, and it's also kind of the most elaborate in terms of participation. Right now, the table exists exactly as the last time it was used. It was used last on September 17th, 2016 at 6:59 p.m. in Boston. And there were 5 headlines at the time that all came from the news in the last 24 hours. So between September 16th and 17th, VW promised an electric car, and that was also in a giant marquee. Clinton promised immigration reform. This was leading to the election, so that's also there. Trump promised to stand with Cubans because he was trying to get the Cuban vote in Miami. That's over there. And tea from a spray vial's end to soggy bags. That's an English inventor was trying to sell us some kind of thing. And then the last person who participated promised to show up. So the way this works is when someone sits there, the person who's helping you says, come and make a promise. First, I'm going to erase the promise from the last person. So they take these letters off and they redistribute them. And another performer does the same thing in the back, so they mirror each other. So that promise disappears. Then they ask you what you want to promise. People have usually been thinking about it. They say it. We make sure it's the right length, right? Because there's not unlimited space. They typeset it as you say it. And then the participant explains that this is a kind of form of contract, a promise is a form of contract, so we're going to put it on paper. And because it's an artwork, it's both a contract and a drawing. So they tear a piece of paper, they put it down, they start to make a rubbing, and essentially you start to make a drawing together. And they speak a lot about what a contract is and what a drawing is. So then it gets numbered. There's going to be 2, like an edition, but also like a contract has, each party gets a copy. So the museum and the artist keep one, and you will keep another one. Then once that copy has been done, they turn to you and they ask you for your first choice. They say, how do you want to put your mark on this contract? You can put your name, you can put your thumbprint, or you can sign it with blood. And then people make their choice. Then once they sign it, it's given to the other performer who now starts to write your promise on the wall. And then the person here makes the second copy. Same speech, maybe repeats a few things about promises and the values of words, and then once it's signed again, it's like, well, now this promise is going to happen. I need your word. And it's like, some people believe their bond is a money deposit, so you're welcome to put money in the piggy bank. Maybe you can want to swear on the Holy Bible, or maybe you want to swear over the Jupiter stone, or maybe you want to ring the spell and we can do a pinky promise, or a witness will come and witness this. There's other sacred texts, or there's the US Constitution, or there's these things people say, or something of your own choosing. And that's the moment when the promise happens. So it takes about 8 minutes. There's a little more information that goes into it, but it's just to really make the viewer aware of, A, you're actually making something happen here right now, and your voice is the thing that has the power to it. And there's also an insinuation always, over and over. Why is it that 2 strangers who just meet can trust each other almost instantly, but why do we have such a low level of trust for these big public announcements? Which is, I don't know the answer. That's actually something I'm always asking myself. Why is it so easy to do it one-on-one? And why is it becoming increasingly difficult to do it in larger groups? And then you leave with a drawing you made. And that's also, which will have the promise you made and all these other promises. And I'm always curious, like, all these promises are going to be broken slowly. But probably yours will probably be the only one that is not broken. So that's how this piece works.
So, and if we think about that, if we start to kind of move over this way, voice, I think, is something that is recurrent in your work as a kind of mode of bond. I think there's certainly works like Broadside here, where participants are invited to step up to a pedestal and read an oath, a kind of public oath that one is asked to give in court as a juror. But I think maybe we'll go even a little bit further, because this is something that each of you can kind of take a look at yourselves and decide to participate in or not. And I'll just point out off to our left by the entrance a very early work that also engages voice in a very different way. This is a work called Masterpieces Without the Director. It's in the vitrine that you see over here. Paul made it in collaboration with an artist named Spencer Finch. And basically what Paul and Spencer did was to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, talk to people who were exiting the museum about works that they had seen in the museum that were moving for them or in some way important for them, recorded those conversations with those spectators, and then put together a kind of a rogue audio tour of the actual collection that of course plays on this idea of the audio tours that one might pick up at the entrance of a museum, to kind of go with a Walkman or a stick, kind of walking through and listening to a kind of voice of authority talk about why a work is important. I think one of the things that's particularly compelling for me about this work is this idea that of course occurs again and again, that the idea of the spectator is also an important voice. They're bringing their own capacities for understanding, their own interests to the work. Right. And I think that's something that occurs again and again. I think one of the things that also, and maybe you can, Paul, talk a little bit about the work and kind of how it came about. There's also some fun stories about what the Met.
Yes. Well, what Dean said is right. When I made this piece, it's the earliest piece in the show. And as an artist, you always think like, now I get it, now I get it. And you had like this forward vision. So it was interesting in doing this show to realize that the oldest piece in the show that I did in my early 20s is almost exactly the same as Public Trust in many ways. And you think, and you're going in circles and you don't realize it. Hopefully the circles are getting more refined though. But the thing is that it's just to frame the participant's voice, you know. And Jean-Luc Godard, who's a French film director, used to say it takes two to make an image, right? And that's always on the forefront of my mind. It's like an artwork is not just the artwork. The artwork is, it takes two of us, right? It's like it takes someone to make the image, it takes someone to look at the image. That's when the art happens. And Masterpieces actually asked people specifically if they had seen the masterpieces of the Met, which is this tour that you can rent out. That's the fastest way to look at the museum. They take you to all the masterpieces, and the masterpieces are identified with these giant numerals. So we were asking people, hey, did you see this one? You know, and it'd be like, yes, tell us what you think. So the tour gives you this feedback from non-expert viewers. And the funny story was that Spencer Finch and I were like 24 or something, and we're doing this piece, and somehow the legal department of the Met found out, and we got the scary call from the legal department saying, you know, we're going to turn you into dust, and we were terrified, and we called Creative Time, and Creative Time at the time was this really, it still is a very fierce organization that makes public art in New York, and we're like, whoa! Help, you know, we're dead. And they very ably just turned it around by calling the Met and said, this is so good, you're taking these two nobodies and you're going to totally make their careers. We're going to send a press release, let's work together. When are they going to be served? You know, so we can like really help them out. This is great, it's going to put them in the map. And then the Met just totally backed off and actually turned it around and was like, they can have their tour in the, you know, on the sidewalk in front of the Met. So for one day, that's how long the piece lasted. For one day, we had these cans, and you could either buy them, or you could give us your driver's license and take the tape and then return it, and then we'll give you your driver's license back. So that's how that ended. And sadly, there's only like a tiny few left. So.
And we managed to get them here.
And we managed to have 4, yeah.
So as we go through, I think maybe another work that we can talk about that also involves this idea of the voice and also individual exchanges, also keys, which are a recurring object, is this work, which is called Key to the City. Actually, Creative Time comes in again because this work was commissioned by Creative Time in 2010. The thing that's interesting here is that, of course, we all know about the key to the city, this kind of symbolic offering that, you know, is a bestowing of honor upon an individual for a particular thing that they may have done. Normally something in the city of New York that was given by the mayor. What I think is a very special moment is that for the month of June in 2010, when the piece was made, then Mayor Michael Bloomberg said, okay, Paul, I'm not going to give any keys to the city this month. That honor is something that I am leaving up to you. Paul then generously decided, actually, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to give it back to all of you. So the kind of podium that you see here with all of these books on it was set up in the very center of Times Square. And people could come and give each other a key to the city. You'll see that in these ledgers, which are signed and dated, there is a kind of a place for someone to sign their name, to say why they're giving that other individual a key to the city. And then there's also a kind of opportunity for reciprocity, where that other person can give you a key for whatever reason. One of the things that I think is also important to recognize about this work is that in this case, the key to the city is not just a symbolic key, it's an actual working key. So one of the other things that you received was a small kind of passport-like book that contained a number of sites that you would be able to access using your key. So in each of the 5 boroughs, also in the Bronx, in Manhattan. So one of the things that you could do in Manhattan was flick on the light switch of a light pole that was in Bryant Park. Symbolically, you could also go to Eddie's Sweet Shop in Queens and get a free scoop of ice cream.
It varied, the sites, the 24 sites, and they tried to speak about like what makes public space in an urban setting. And the goal was to make 2 things happen, was to make the key to the city of New York not symbolic, but actual. So like we pursued like these 24 sites spread throughout all the boroughs, trying to open different qualities of public space. And as you can imagine, it started with a list of 50, and we're just like, no, yes. Like we got a lot of no's. We almost got a yes for a tomb, which I was really excited about, because so it was like an empty tomb that was for sale in Queens. And the whole idea was that that's also public space, right? When we die, we end up in public space, unless it's a super private cemetery. So it was like, okay, how can this become actual and map and open real spaces? And second is, once it's not symbolic, is how do we make it so it's not just for those very special people who are in history? So the negotiation with the mayor was that he would devolve his power. So for 1 month, anyone could bestow the key on anyone else. So you couldn't get the key, it could be given to you. So that's why there are always exchanges. Usually 2 people would show up to give each other the keys. And if you go through these ledgers, this was like back to voice, right? Like I wrote a ceremony, the passport while you waited in line lets you fill it out, so you're practicing your words and says you're gonna have to read this out loud. And it really culminates in Times Square facing each other over this plinth, because it really was the key to the city. So for 1 month. So then you say I, Sarah Elizabeth Teplai, on this day, 22nd June 2010, bestowed the key to the city to Damian Wallach for being an awesome friend and neighbor. And then it says, do you accept this key to the city? Then the person says yes, and then go, then by the power temporarily granted to me and this work of art, I, Sarah Elizabeth Tepley, award you this key. And then it says in parentheses, you may now hand the key and the booklet to the recipient. And it's hard in these two tables to convey the madness of Key to the City. We gave away 19,000 keys over 30 days. And it was, and also I kind of thought that this would be armchair traveling, that people would be like, well, that's nice, right? I can go here. But people really started to go to all these places in big numbers, and some were really hard to get to. So it was sort of like I don't know, yeah, I was like, this is the piece that's really hard to ever do again.
And I think one of the things that's kind of really incredibly special for me about this work is that, you don't even necessarily need to think about it as art. I mean, This is something that no matter what anybody's particular experience is with art, whether you're visiting museums all the time or have never been to a museum, this is the kind of work that embraces all comers. And I think that kind of democracy is something that also is very present in so many of the works that you've made.
Yeah, and in a way for me, for the public works, this is the perfect situation where often people would participate, and when I was at the site, people would be like, people would ask me, is this art? Which usually that's the question an artist gets with suspicion, right? Like this is art? But the question was really kind of like apropos of just as a footnote, is this art? Because people came here not because it's a work by me or because it is an artwork. They came because they wanted to have the Key to the City and have this experience. Or people went to public trust to make a public promise. I always say that if a monument is successful, actually the authorship just peels away, right? So it's like, we go like, who made Mount Rushmore? Who made Statue of Liberty? Who, like all these big monuments, it's like, if they actually work, who made them? Irrelevant, right? They just exist in the world. So that's always an ambition that I have in the back of my mind.
And I think in this work in particular, it's also because the joy quotient is so high.
Yes. Which ones do you want to talk about
so
next?
maybe because we're here, we can talk a little bit about this series, Heavier Than Air.
Right.
So one of the kind of differences I think that happens in the work is that in some of the earliest works that Paul has produced, he is the kind of enactor in the work. He's looking at experiments by earlier scientists, explorations by early geographers, and using the kind of material that they've produced as a kind of score, almost in the way that one would use musically, to kind of create a different experience and a different interpretation for what those individuals have made. In the case of the series Heavier Than Air, Paul has recreated kites that are after designs by early aeronautic engineers who were looking to basically create the first flying machines. So folks like Alexander Graham Bell or Joseph Lecornu. What Paul has done is to take their designs, create actual kites out of them, and taken them to beaches and flown them. Importantly, though, on each of them you can see that they all contain a small object and a very individually and separately colored string on the tether. On this small object, there is an alarm clock that's been hacked so that it depresses the shutter of a single-use disposable camera. So what happens is this whole apparatus is taken up into the air with the kite, and when the shutter is depressed, it takes an image down the string where we see Paul standing on the beach flying the kite. One of the things that's really important for me about this work is the way that kind of layers of time happen. Mm-hmm. So we have, of course, this idea of taking this historical object and recreating it. Then the kind of moment that you've actually taken it to fly it. But I think there's also this other moment of thinking about the way that time can actually mingle and interchange. So this idea of recreating a scientific experiment, for instance, when we recreate a scientific experiment, we're always doing it in the present. that discovery that we're making, even though it may be separated by decades or hundreds of years, is always something that we're proving to ourselves in that moment. Yeah. And I think those ideas of the way that time layers is something that comes up again and again in some of these earlier works.
Yeah, and I think I've always been interested in history. I think I probably got that from my dad, who pretty much is the only thing he reads is history. And if you think about it, I'm someone in my 20s at this point, and I'm trying to imagine participation. How do you make yourself part of history? How do you become part of the story? Which in the later works I understand more as a communal event, but you know, when you're young, you tend to be more egocentric. So I thought the only way I can do this is by exemplary, you know, is to be like, look at me inserting myself into the story of aviation. And it's like, but it could be you, right? So often in these portraits, I'm small and distant, or my back is to the camera, because at the time, I thought one of the few ways I can do participation is by saying, it's me, but it could be you. You could make this. It's really no big shakes. It's made from the hardware store. It's skilled, but not crazy skilled. You know, like it's made from research. So I kept thinking that to insert yourself in history, I could only do it this way. And I was just, in other works at the same time, trying to draw you in. And I was going on two tracks, try to draw you into simpler works or try to insert myself into these stories, but make it simple and available, and so you could have empathy. And I keep thinking of them as exemplary works. It's like, it could be you. It's me, but it could be you. Yeah.
And so I think... Yeah.
No, it's funny in the layers of time. It's like, it's me, it could be you, the same way that it was Alexander Graham Bell, you know, 100 years ago.
So, which will bring us actually to the last work here that we'll talk about, which is called Men on the Moon Rest Period. This is a kind of conglomeration of two separate things happening. The first being Paul's recreation in the studio of an Edison phonograph, which is invented, of course, by Thomas Edison. It is the first sound recording device. This object also is a playback device at the same time.
Right.
In a kind of slight twist, however, what happens when one actually uses this object as a playback device is it also records sound at the site where it's being played. So if I'm talking as we're listening to it, it's also going to record my voice onto these wax cylinders. You'll see when you look at the wax cylinders that they actually have small grooves, and so those are corresponding, say, to the grooves that you would find on a vinyl record. The other kind of important element, and Paul, maybe you can talk a little bit about what that other element is the content here.
Yeah, I was thinking of I was really into Americana. I was really into these ideas of histories, and I thought of two American myths, and I was trying to think of these two big competing American stories. And one is the self-made man who changes the world by inventing one thing, and hopefully becomes incredibly wealthy in the process. And we still have people like that. And Edison was someone like that. I was like, he's like an artist. He changed the entire world by inventing this, the machine that lets us put stories into objects. And then the other story I was thinking was Apollo 11, the most epic trip humanity has ever taken, Man on the Moon, which is collective, tax-based, thousands of people working together as teams to put 3 men on the moon, actually 2. And so sad, one's just orbiting the moon, never gets to step on it. So working with NASA, I got the audio recordings, right? Because they recorded the entire mission on tape, even silence, right? And so I'm going to collapse these two stories. So first I rediscovered the sound machine, and then I got the audio tapes from NASA, and then I've started to diligently dub the entire 23 hours men were on the moon during Apollo 11 onto these wax cylinders, which only hold a minute of sound each. So then I would load an empty cylinder after it was cast, blast the sound from the tapes, hand crank it, and then index it. So each one is indexed to the second of what roughly 60 seconds of the Apollo 11 mission are stored here. But like Dean said, they can't be played. Well, they can be played once, but The first recording machine had a bug and a feature. This is one of the first microphones, and it records and plays at the same time. So when you play them, you record over them, yourself listening to them, right? So they had to, it was the first one. It wasn't ready for it wasn't consumer grade yet. So I always have this book, which is a book that's written almost like a play that tells you what each cylinder has and what was recorded onto each one. This is the third chapter. It's a really big project that I actually have not finished. This is rest period. So about 2/3 of it are the astronauts sleeping on the surface of the moon. But NASA very diligently recorded that, so it's just like radio silence for a couple of hours.
And some snores.
And some snores. Should we ask questions? Open it to questions?
We're happy to open it up for questions. We have about 10, 15 minutes for questions, if anybody has any.
It's like, Paul, you know the work for a long time.
Yes.
There's always this kind of research center, the story of Man on the Moon, the story of Edison, the story of Magellan. What are your reading habits like? Are you just constantly reading nonfiction books? I picture you just sort of in a weird library somewhere with nonfiction stacks around you.
Well, what's crazy is I love fiction, but every year I've read less and less fiction to the point where I haven't read fiction in years. So, and I was a good student, but it wasn't like a pleasant thing for me. Like reading nonfiction was like chewing glass. But I find that I've gotten really to enjoy it. So for like public trust, I read an incredible book about the archaeology of the oath, and it was like in a million years I would never have thought that would be like, this is really interesting, how the Romans gave oaths and how the Greeks had said oaths, and how the Athenians loved oaths and the Spartans hated oaths, because the Spartans thought that oaths made liars out of people. They're like, well, everyone breaks their word, so you're setting up people to fail. Like you should never take an oath. While the Athenians were like all about like saying 1,000,000 oaths for everything, or how and so yeah, I do a lot of research and yeah, I like it, and it's actually gotten way easier. I used to feel so guilty because I used to leave my studio and go to the New York Public Central Library in the morning and be like, I'm just going to look this one thing up. And when you do this in Google, you're like, I'm going to look one thing up, and then it's like 5 p.m., where did the day go? That used to happen to me in the library, and it'll be like, it was my day off from work, and I didn't go to the studio, I ended up in the library all day. And now that happens to me with the internet. But at least I'm sitting in my studio, so there's less guilt.
Natalie.
I was wondering if you could say more about your experience working with different communities, especially with the Keys project, and the kind of cultural specificity that comes out when you're working, in New York versus other locations.
And
that's a super good question. And I've recently started to speak more and more about the front end of an artwork and the back end of an artwork. Because we tend to think about works of art as like, artists had an idea, they made a work of art, then it's finished, and here it is, look at it. But when you make work in communities, like all the works on these tables, the back end is really important, which is, and it's not visible to the viewers, to that finish. It's like, for Key to the City, was talking to the 24 sites and working with them together, from the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and speaking with like the head of the cathedral, speaking with the owner of a small community garden in the Bronx, and saying, you will be part of this work, or your little garden, and negotiating those things, telling the cathedral, there is a benefit for you to be in association with a small community garden, and then turning it around, telling the community garden, there is something in this for you to be in association with this cathedral, and in failing, or trying to convince the police department, and that weaving in and out of the real world is super interesting. And sadly, I can't make that visible. It's just, but I feel that the artwork is for those people too, and the artwork is happening in those negotiations, and the work is being made in those negotiations. I can't tell you how many times 50, 60, 70% of these artworks is made by someone either misunderstanding you or volunteering a really good idea, and that's just how the work gets made. There's a work there where you can photocopy the face of a bust, of a historical bust, and then it kind of comes alive. My idea for that was terrible. My idea was, Well, the seed is okay. The seed was like, I want to take something from the permanent collection of a museum and something from the office of the museum. So something from storage and something from the office, two things are invisible in a museum, and put them together to make this piece. So it was first done in the Portland Art Museum in Oregon, and we went to the accountant's office, and then the registrar and someone else came with this like head of Pericles, you know, and then I thought, we will show the part of the sculpture no one can see, the bottom of the base. So like we photocopied and came out, and the accountant was like, that's boring. And then they're like, and then I don't even remember who said, it's like, let's photocopy the face. And then it totally left my hands. Like suddenly like the accountant and the registrar were like, copying, you know, enlarging, and I was like, work's done, you know, like so that's a very small example, but that happens all the time. And the work gets shaped by the people who are participating in it and helping you make it. Yeah. Any other?
Yeah,
Yes.
sure. Do you at all think about rituals or the role of rituals in public life? So I think that many of these pieces, you know, by oath, you know, kind of almost bureaucratic, you know,
Yes.
the key from one person to another, and that, you know, kind of some kind of social or like even statal, official ritual. What does it mean? How do you think about it? How does it engage with the people that come to those projects as participants?
I think about that all the time, and what I'm looking really specifically is, when does it become visible, right? So like one thing I was obsessed for a long time was the check desk in the bank, and how there's like the thing with the date and the little forms, and I was obsessed with the pen that's chained, and I was like, the chained pen means that the bank thinks you're gonna steal it, but that also is what gives you permission to use it, right? Like there's like a weird thing becomes visible there, and if you're in a gallery and you want it to, and so I've used it in the past, if I put a piece of paper in this gallery with a pedestal and a pen, everyone's gonna go like, I don't know if I can touch that, right? But if you chain it, people are like, well, that, you understand, right? It's like, oh, I'm supposed to write on this piece of paper. So it's not quite a ritual, but I think it's embedded in that. Or I was also thinking a lot about the DMV and how like they take your portrait, and I'm like, why do they call it take your portrait? You're giving them your portrait. And so I try to pay attention to like language and those little instances where it's so part of our lives we can't see it, and then is there a way to twist it so next time you go to the DMV you're like I always have this fantasy, like the person at the DMV would be like, we can take your photograph, or today we have an oil painter, but it will take 8 hours. And then you'd be like, right, they're taking my portrait.
We should have tried to do that here.
We can always do it.
So one question actually that I have is, from some of the earlier work to the more recent work, there is a significant shift in terms of the kind of subjectivity. So in many of the earlier works, the subject, the person telling the story, is you. I mean, it could be, of course, somebody else, but it really, that story or the enaction of certain actions come from you. In later work, you're actually kind of shifting that kind of possibility and making an invitation to the public. And I think one of the things that's interesting for me, and I've kind of thought a lot about that shift, is that it actually coincides with the birth of your daughter in 2004.
Oh, you slipped a tricky question.
And I think though that I wonder if you can actually kind of talk about if there was a kind of shift, because certainly I think in the later work, things there's a certain kind of empathy, a certain kind of come to me and bring your experience and your story to me. And I wonder if that's something that you've thought about in terms of the way that those interactions fundamentally changed after that time, even though there's a kind of straight through line. Yeah,
it's funny how life works, because there's the two projects that really changed me were Taylor Square, which is at the other end, and Mi Casa, Su Casa was also on the table, and those were projects that really, conscious of things I was doing unconsciously in public space and with participation. And that was when our daughter was born. And it's really hard to untangle cause and effect, but how many people here have kids? Right, it's like the thing is like the kid's born and then you're like, this has nothing to do with me, it's all about you now, right? And I think that shift happens when you're like, me, my life, I'm gonna die, oh my God, you know, and then there's like, meh, you know, and you're like, oh, okay, I'm part of a bigger story here, right? And you're not moving out, and so I think that it's hard to untangle for me, but those things did happen at the same time. That moment where it really turned inside out, which was like, oh, maybe instead of me flying the kite, everyone gets to fly a kite. And the birth of our daughter, those happen all in the same, like 12, 18 months roughly. Yeah.
And I wonder, maybe, Natalie, this is kind of specific, but maybe you can actually talk a little bit about Mi Casa, Su Casa, which people will also see on one of the tables. Basically, what the kind of how that piece began, because I think it is one that contains a lot of these ideas of issues about trust, exchanges, the keys as well, and is one that kind of formed in distinct relationship to different communities.
Yeah. First, any other questions before we go into this long anecdote? No? Okay. So Mi Casa Su Casa was a very dispersed project because it was really the final thing. It was just a lecture.
Should we walk over?
Sure. Let's go look at it. So this is all that's left. It's super immaterial, but I was asked by an exhibition called Insight, which used to happen from every couple of years in Tijuana and San Diego, who are like one city in Mexico and one in the United States, and they're like abut each other, right hugging the border. And what I did was I just asked people, like 6 people from Mexico and 6 people from the United States, 6 from Tijuana and 6 from San Diego, to show me their keychain. So people would be like, here's my keychain. And then I would photograph their hand holding their keychain. And then I said, I want to go to each space and every single thing each key opens. So then it became this kind of weird tour of their life. You know, it would be like, this is to the drawer in my closet. I would photograph that. This is for the garage. I would photograph that. It's like, oh, this is for my grandma that sometimes I have to go to her house, but she's in Mexico. So we would drive across the border, and then they would show me that. So there's like, it's almost like a David Altman movie. Like each subject leads to the next subject in this story. So it has like this flow, and it goes back Mexico, United States, Mexico, United States, and crossing the border back and forth. So the lecture is very animated, has hundreds of beautiful photographs and interesting photographs and weird things people have. But as I give the lecture, I keep talking about like, why do we have these keys? And why is everything defined as open or closed? And if everything is open or closed, what opens it? So every time we cross the border, I would mention like, my passport's a kind of key, or sometimes, so I would just throw in everything into that lecture that would speak about open, closed, and what opens and closes things. And at the end of the lecture, after I talked enough about that and trust and lack of trust, I would take out the key to the front door of my house, and I had a little key copying machine, and I would say, hey, I'm going to copy the key to my house, and I'm going to give it to one of you, whomever wants this key, but in exchange, you have to let me copy any key of your choosing from your keychain, and I'm going to give it to someone else in the audience. And that's why I had these. So you know, when you go to the key store, they need to match the blank. So these are the most common blanks in Tijuana and San Diego. So all it would take, there would be like a moment of hesitation, but the moment one person would do it, it's like, well, no one's leaving without their little artwork. So then like a line would form, and it would be this round robin. Like, I copy your key, I give it to the person behind you, then that person lets me copy a key, and I give it to the next person. And then at the end, the last person has no partner, I get their key, right? So this other key chain is one for each time I gave the lecture. And the same way as Key to the City and other pieces, I did 11 times because it's like I'm traveling around both cities. So like, One lecture was at a prison, one lecture was at an architecture school, one lecture was at an after-school program for youth, the other one was a bird watchers club. So one was actually an open mic bohemian bar where you just like sign up your name and you're the next act. And so it really varied, a little bit like Quito City. It varied in locations, it varied in kinds of locations, and it spoke to different kinds of people.